I'm super excited for today. We're doing something a little bit different. Julie Reese is going to be presenting. She has been a huge help for me in navigating like the mental side of doubting and asking questions, really helping me see how mental health impacts things and also how it doesn't impact things. Like when I would ascribe almost too much to my anxiety and OCD. So very big influence in my life. So I'm very excited to have her here with us. A few things about Julie that I'm going to read off. She has a PhD in clinical psychology. She is a professor of psychology at Goshen. She has clinical experience with adults and married couples in serious conflict, and she is married with 2 married daughters. One thing she did not include in the introduction, she also might be the nicest person on planet Earth. So like the singular nicest person. So very excited about this.
I think some of my students would beg to differ.
That's true. I've never had you grade for me. Maybe I'd have a different answer at that point. But yeah, so Julie, if you're all ready, I'll let you just kind of take it from here.
Sure.
And if you guys want to, really quick, last thing, if you have any questions, we're going to be doing a Q&A at the end as well. So hang on to those until then. All right, very good.
Well, and I would say, Justin, I'm okay with people asking questions in the midst of my talk. So yeah, welcome to do that. So thank you for letting me join you. This is my first time being a part of this group. So I feel honored to be invited to come join. And while Justin and I had a bit of an exchange about what this might be, as I'm kind of determining what I was going to say, I'm not sure that it hits the mark of what you all want. So that's why I'm very willing to entertain questions even during. Because I took a little bit broader scope than just mental health. I looked more, I'm coming more with information about like emotion in general. And certainly not all mental health is about emotion, but I think a lot of times what we're talking about when we're looking at doubts that are not allayed with just evidence and kind of rational response is what's going on in our emotional lives. So whether that's mental health, whether it has a diagnosis, whether we have a diagnosis attached to who we are or not, that emotions are really a major part of a lot of our doubts in life, not just when it comes to the big questions like, why are we here? How did the world come to be? Is there something outside of us? What happens after we die? But just in general. So that's the approach that I took. And as I said, feel free to jump in with questions, comments, and so forth. So one of the things that I always like to start when I look at emotions is, what are emotions? Most of us kind of go through life and we know what emotions are, we experience them. And so we don't really think about what they are, but from a psychological perspective, they are kind of how our subjective experience. So, you know, when I say that I'm scared, most humans kind of at a gut level know what that means, right? And I don't have to give a lot of articulation to that. So that's what we call the subjective experience. Another part of emotion is our physiological response. So, and we can measure that, whether it's racing heartbeat, shallow breath, clenched fists, flushed face. We have various signs that we can often actually see in other people, and we can measure biologically that indicate physiological arousal. What's interesting with physiological arousal is that there is not a specific footprint, if you will, that we could just have 6 physiological markers. And by me looking at your range of blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate and galvanic skin response, which is like you're sweating, I couldn't just say, oh, given these parameters, I know that you're angry or I know that you're excited. So again, there's a lot of overlap in our physiological arousal and what kind of emotions we may be experiencing. And then finally, behavior is a component to it. So, we can often, there are things that we do behaviorally when we feel certain things. So when you hear someone scream, you assume that's either fear or excitement, right? It's not, so we have certain behaviors that we would say correspond with certain emotions. And the reason that's important to realize that emotions are made up of three things is because each of those, like I said, they vary. And then we have an ability to impact each of those in various ways, which I will get into at some point. So that's really important. And then our thoughts, so we could actually kind of put a fourth quadrant, if you will. Our thoughts are also part of our emotions, so that when you have an experience, you subjectively feel fear, you are trembling in fear, and you want to run away, your thoughts are integral in deciding what you're going to do, how you're going to act upon that behavioral urge, if you will. And so if my thoughts are, I have experienced this situation before, let's say I'm running and I encounter a dog that's really aggressive, and it's a dog that I've encountered before. I have an ability to know kind of how to manage this dog. Then my thoughts are going to help me determine that, hey, I don't have to flee from this dog. I can handle this experience. So thoughts are also an important part of it. And that's important because, again, when we talk about emotions and how we deal with emotions, particularly linked to doubts, we can consider which of those facets we start to try to change or manage in a different way. So that moves me to my next question then, right? Can we control our emotions? So the answer is no and yes. So no, in the sense that we all grew up experiencing emotions. In fact, we all know, hopefully, 2- and 3-year-olds that don't look like they can control their emotions at all, right? There are times that like all they are is angry, or all they are is excited, or all they are is mad, whatever that is. And it's worthless to tell a little 2- or 3-year-old, snap out of it. And in some ways, that part of us remains as we go through life. So if I get startled, that I can't just in that instant tell myself, oh, don't be scared because I was startled. So there are experiences where we have no control over our emotion. But at the same time, given that I said that emotion is not just kind of our subjective experience or our knee-jerk physiological reaction, we do have an ability to work on our behaviors and our thoughts related to that. And as we manage those things, it's just kind of like a muscle where the more that you work on managing things and choosing different ways of responding to situations that are going to be cause emotional upheaval, the better we are at being able to manage our thoughts, bring our physiological arousal down, and even start to turn our subjective experience in a different way. So let me give you a little bit of a anatomy and physiology lesson here. So there are actually what are called 2 paths to emotional experience in our body. So if you think of often emotion is from something external to us. And so that sensory experience, so whether it's feeling something, seeing something, that sensory experience travels through our neurons, up through our brainstem, and goes to the amygdala. So the amygdala is just one of several structures. And again, this is a very simple way of explaining it. It's much more complex than this. But it's one structure that we call kind of the lower brain, or the part of the limbic system, which is very involved in just raw emotion. And both paths go that direction, but one path, it goes into the amygdala and then we respond. So we immediately respond after that initial surge without any higher order processing that happens. And so that's why I said, like, when we're talking about being startled and there's no conscious thought about how we're responding, that is that simple loop up and back just to our amygdala that immediately responds to a situation that is unexpected. Okay, and that's often called the low road to emotion. Now, like I said, knee jerk, it's like a 2-year-old, we don't have much control of that. But the other path is called the high road to emotion. And I said it goes up the same way, but it then goes from the amygdala, and there are neurons that connect to the prefrontal cortex, which is, it's right here. The frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex is the outer part of that part of the brain. And that's one area that really distinguishes us from the animals. And that is what enables us to engage in higher order thinking. So to consider, what do I want to do? What are the possible outcomes if I do this? So let's take anger, for example, right? You get angry, your response, initial response might be like, I want to scream, or I want to chew out this person in front of me, or I want to smack this person in front of me. But the prefrontal cortex enables us to say, okay, wait a minute. What are the potential outcomes of me doing that, right? This bad outcome, that bad outcome, that bad outcome. What are some other ways that I can respond to this situation that's not going to lead to that outcome? And then from there, the neural activity projects to other places in the cortex and we react. So you should naturally realize, right, that the higher road to emotion is lengthier, so it takes more time, and it requires intentionality. So we have these two systems, and like I said, anytime that you're practicing anything, you're actually learning on the neural level because you're activating those systems that then over time become activated more readily. And that's what's called the neural basis of learning. So that's encouraging because again, while we do have experiences of emotion that we can't control, we have another system that enables us to practice control, practice being intentional in how we respond. So let me just stop a moment and kind of check in. Do you have any questions at this point? It might be very elementary what I'm saying. It might have brought up other questions for you. Okay, so I'll keep going. So as I said, part of our emotional experience is our thinking. And that is, if you have obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, part of what happens, PTSD, I can put those are different classes of psychological disorders, but they have similar features in that the brain neurological loop that alerts us that there's danger in life, that we should be scared of something, that we should be hypervigilant, basically gets usurped and goes from 0 to 20 like that. Sometimes from clear triggers externally, and sometimes from triggers that we can't identify. And so part of, again, learning to not elevate our system of extreme emotion or jumping to kind of the worst case scenario is being reflective in how we think about things just in our everyday life. And part of that is also learning about biases in our thinking. And there are tons of biases that psychologists have identified, but I just want to talk about really two of them right now. And the first one is called confirmation bias. So that is when people pay attention to information that already affirms or supports what they believe to be true. And it's often to the exclusion of paying attention to information that legitimately contradicts or calls into question what they believe. So this is true for all of us. It is much, again, from an emotional standpoint, it's much more comforting to have a belief and think that all the evidence supports that belief than to encounter and take seriously evidence that refutes or at least calls into question that belief. So it's always important to consider, have you jumped to conclusions? Are you feeling too confident about a belief you have simply because you keep hearing the same thing, hanging around the same people that want you, that are just affirming what you're believing and saying, oh yes, you're reading the same books from the same authors in the same tribe. So that's really important. Kind of the other side of that then is the disconfirmation bias. And that's when people work very hard to refute any evidence to the contrary. So again, rather than be open and look honestly at evidence that, at least on the surface, appears to be contrary, they just give all of their energy to refuting what seems to be contradictory, rather than looking at the total picture that's in front of them. And again, this connects back to what I'm talking about in emotion, because in the literature on persuasion, so if you think about it, a lot of times when we hear information that is unsettling, it's a message that's been persuasive. Like it's a claim that's been made, some claim of a truth, and it is often presented to try to convince you or convince people of something. And so when we examine the persuasion research, again, what we find is that there are two paths that people use to persuade others. And so the one path is called the peripheral route to persuasion. And that is essentially using emotion, using feelings and secondary cues in a persuasive message to try to get people to be convinced. So much of marketing, especially on television, is like this. So if you think about it, what are the most prominent means of trying to sell SUVs today, large SUVs? On television, what are on the advertisements?
One would be like an appeal to an authority, like an award or a prize or something like that.
That's all right. Yes. So that's, an appeal to authority. And that would actually be an example of the central route of persuasion, which is the other side. Okay. Which is good. You provide an example that's contrary to what I wanted, but that's okay. What else do you see? Others of you. None of you watch TV. That's good.
Jonathan, what do you see on SUV ads?
I don't watch enough TV to see SUV ads.
Okay. You gotta use chess or something as an example with him, Julie.
And
I can't think of a chess example. Okay.
I was just kidding.
No, I understand, and probably they don't use any chess examples. I can't probably come up with anything with peripheral route of persuasion.
I use YouTube Premium, so I don't even see YouTube ads. So I don't.
Sure. So SUVs. So I'm old enough that I remember when minivans came out in the 80s, and SUVs I think are similar today. So when the minivans came out in the 80s, all the advertisements had them swing the minivan door open, and who came out? Soccer kids with their mom who was smiling from ear to ear, right? And so what were they selling? They were selling the association buy a minivan, you will have a happy family with lots of busting kids out at the scene. And it's similar with SUVs today, right? It's the family, or it's, the mom and the child with the 3 dogs and, all of the backpacking gear in SUVs. So again, they're trying to sell you the feeling of, wow, this is a happy family. They're doing something fun. I'd love to do something fun. And that's why I need an SUV. That's the route of persuasion. And Need, I hope I'm not getting too raw here, but as a psychologist, it grinds me when I see all of these ads for medication, particularly for psychological disorders. And what do you always hear? You hear this beautiful music in the background and you see these happy people together. And then you find out it's for, some kind of, even, again, I'm not trying to be raw, but like erectile dysfunction disorder. You're like, you would have no idea if you're thinking, right? You're thinking this is for, I don't know, depression or something. But again, all these commercials are about happy people, smiling people. It's all about getting you to feel good so that you're paying attention more to the environment presented rather than listening to, okay, all these side effects might be that, and that, or, they're trying to suck you in by the emotional messaging. So that's peripheral route to persuasion. And again, keep in mind, right? This is the majority of advertising, you all, because we don't often pay attention when ads anywhere, right? Whether we're watching YouTube, whether we're on any social media platform, they come up, we're annoyed by them, but people can often remember, catchy ads. They can remember, I can remember tunes, especially when I was younger, of that used to sell like the Big Mac or medication when I was young. I don't recall them as much now because I don't tend to watch commercials. But anyway, so that's a peripheral route of persuasion. The central route of persuasion is when you use reasons, when you give clear data to try to convince someone that they should buy a product or endorse a claim and so forth. But again, remember what I said, that feelings, the fast route to feelings is easier than the intentional route of thinking about feelings and being mindful of how we're going to respond. And it's the same way in the central route of persuasion. It takes a lot more effort to pay attention to reasons, to data, to complex messaging, right? Where there might be nuances than it does to watch that happy family come out of the SUV. So that's, again, we are fed that all the time, that emotions are what are important, and they are always vying for our attention in terms of buying products every day. So I would love to hear from you all, or some. Again, where else do you see this messaging in our culture that basically your feelings are king? Where else do we hear that? Like that our emotion, trust your emotions, or, this is how your decision should be made based on how you feel.
Gender ideology would be an obvious example.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right? Marriage. You should only stay in marriages if you're happy, you all. So let me share a story, actually. And I have my clinical experience as a licensed psychologist is with couples who had very big problems in their marriage. I was used to work in a facility where we had week-long therapy. It was intensive therapy with a couple who many of whom had had affairs or were divorced or divorcing, and they had to come out of their home, stay with a host family, and do intensive therapy every day. So I know I have a heart for marriage, particularly. But I remember in college, in my sociology class, we had to interview someone in our family who was an older adult. So I interviewed my grandmother, and both my grandmother and my grandfather was deceased at that time, but both of my paternal grandparents had lost their first spouse and then had married each other. And so one of the things I was supposed to ask her about, was growing up and getting married. And I remember asking my grandmother, who was a passionate woman, by the way, she wasn't like stoic and stodgy, you all. But I remember asking her, what was it like when your husband died? And how did you decide to marry grandpa, and you had this daughter, and, tell me what that was like. And keep in mind here, you all, my grandmother was not stoic, but I remember her looking at me and just kind of saying, well, Julie, it was tough, but, I knew your grandfather, we were friends, and he had lost his wife too. And we were both Christians. And so we just, started to build this relationship, and we ended up getting married. I mean, it was almost like she was saying it matter-of-factly to me. And I realized at that moment that I, as someone in 2 generations removed from my grandmother, put so much emphasis on happiness in marriage in a way that my grandmother didn't back in 1938. And it was just a reminder to me that, again, our culture is very influential in what we expect, and our expectations often fuel our emotions then as well. So I think that's a big thing in our culture, right? That you should only stay in relationships where you're happy, where you're self-satisfied. And that's very different than when you look at marriages from decades ago. And that's not saying that they weren't happy, but again, it was not driven by this, am I satisfied, am I fulfilled predominantly. What else can you think of? Where else do we get messages that implicitly or explicitly really say, hey, your emotions are the biggest barometer of whether you're going to do X or Y or Z?
I see it a ton with like picking worldviews or religions.
Absolutely. Can you say more, Justin?
Yeah, I think it's especially prevalent right now with like the college crowd that I've kind of been a part of. Very much so. It's like the people just gravitate towards what's emotionally appealing at that time. Like I see a lot of new age stuff, or even like kind of repackaged Buddhism coming up, and just people are latching onto it kind of without asking any questions about it, because it has that emotional appeal,
Right. And what, and anyone can answer here. I have some idea. What do you think it is that either Buddhism or New Age or humanism, what do you think is why is that more appealing, for example, than Christianity or Judaism or Islam? And I know I'm picking all of the monotheistic religions, and I think there is a stronger emotional appeal to the religions that fall out of monotheism. But why do you think that is?
I think some key things I see flare up for people is there's a lot less accountability than there is in Christianity. I think that's a big part of it. And then I also just think the end goal too, like, and this is kind of getting rid of a view of like an afterlife or something like that, because I think that's hard to compare. If like there's a worldview that accepts an afterlife and there's one that's not, and you're trying to compare how it looks in this life. I think like the Christian call in this life is to grow in like nobility and character and things like that. You're not necessarily growing in happiness. We would say like you grow in joy, but it's not in like the happiness that we would hold on to, like in comparing it to something like Buddhism or New Age or something like that, that promises, especially like the law of attraction and manifesting things, stuff like that. It's like very surface level, kind of culturally what drives us towards happiness, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you touched on some key things. I think, again, those are much more, what would I say? Kind of abstract, like there's very little black and white, right? There's like, you be you, or you just kind of blend with the universe. There's no clear right and wrong in many of those. And so then you don't end up coming across as judgmental, right? And we could, because that's really looked down upon today, right? And so anytime we make dividing lines in between what is true and what is not true, what is good and what is not good, it's too uncomfortable. And so I think especially young people, but I would say even more than that, are really drawn to those religions and spiritual ideas where there's just a lot of fluidity, right? And it's just kind of like, let's just be together and share these warm feelings and not be bound by certain duties or morals and so forth. So I think there is a lot in that sense too. And there is a lot of animosity in this country around political issues and so forth. And so I think people are really afraid about that. And so it's just kind of easier to not land anywhere. But certainly there are many, if I look back, my husband and I often watch like old television shows, and I'm certainly not idolizing those, but just looking at the messages were very, very different many years ago, where it wasn't, there wasn't as much of this, feelings are king, feelings are what should drive you in life. And I believe that we just get a lot of messages in that domain in our culture. So I don't want to just talk this whole time. I have some, I guess I can just share a few quick tips, and then I'd love to open for questions. So like I said, going back to where I started, that emotions are made up of subjective experience. And I just think about that meaning like, how do we say we feel, right? I feel happy. I feel whatever. Physiological arousal, behaviors, and thoughts. And all of those, like I said, we can either stoke the flame, right? I can make myself get anxious by raising my heart rate and then thinking about certain things that are of a stressful nature to me, and then acting in ways, pacing, doing things that again correspond with certain feelings, and I can move myself there. And so how do we work on not moving ourselves there? So a couple of things I would say is to be intentional in how you spend your time in each day. There has been so much research in the happiness literature, particularly, that when people help others, when you get involved in encouraging others, that it increases happiness. And I know that happiness is not all of what I've talked about here, but it's that principle that, again, it's in scripture and it's supported by psychological research, that when we move outside of ourselves and when we focus on others and trying to encourage others, giving money, giving time, it starts to shift our focus and it changes our emotional experience as well. Gratitude is another one. There have been numerous studies that have looked at just having people record what they're grateful for in gratitude journals, and that over time that increases happiness and it decreases negative emotion. So that's something that is important. And again, I'm not saying that any of these are a silver bullet. Do them twice and, your depression will go away or your anxiety will go away. These are habits that we must engage in, just like exercising, right? I don't like exercising, you all. I wish if you found a pill that makes someone like to exercise, I'd take it. But I exercise because I know it's important for me. And it's similar in these sorts of things, especially if you're someone that wrestles with anxiety or wrestles with depression. It's something that you have to engage in, whether you feel like it or not. And over time, it will make a difference. Hanging out with people who have overcome. So there are people that have overcome. There are differences in personality just around resilience and an ability to bounce back. And so hanging out with those people and letting, being infected by their ability to not be pulled to and fro with what's going on in life. Now, I'm not talking about those who are not on planet Earth, right? Like they're blinders and they're like, my life is great. Everything's great. I'm not talking about that. Okay. I'm talking about people that are grounded in reality. They can talk about struggles they've had, even struggles they still have, but they don't get stuck in that. And then filling your life with joy, whether that's, like I said, it might be reading scripture. It might be listening to music that you love. It might be walking outside. Exercise has been shown to elevate mood as well. So again, even a behavior that we do that I don't like, as I said, part of it I do not just for my physical health, but also for my mental health is critical. So again, this is probably not revelatory to any of you, but I think I often have to remind myself if I'm feeling down or I've had a couple rough days that, wait a minute, I'm not at the mercy of what's happening in my life, nor how I'm feeling. I can still be intentional in making some choices, calling up someone that I know is going to be able to encourage me and also stay grounded in reality, shutting off the news, deciding not to flip through your social media feed as much. That has also, by the way, been evidence that it correlates, passively scrolling through any social media is almost a sure way to get mild depression at the least. So, okay, I've talked enough. I will be quiet now. Questions you have?
First of all, thank you so much, Julie. I think and this is kind of for everyone involved with Talk About Doubts. A lot of the people, including myself when I was walking this out, it's tough to not just be filled with like dread and anxiety all the time when you're walking out questioning your worldview or something like that, especially because the Christian worldview, when you're looking for peace, when you're looking for joy, it kind of tells you to rest in God. The whole thing we're questioning is if God is really there and stuff like that. So I know there's not a way to maybe completely remedy a lot of those really strong emotions of anxiety and dread and things like that. But for people questioning their worldviews, what are maybe some tips for handling that dread, handling that anxiety that comes with not being sure of exactly what reality looks like? And if that's kind of too big of a can of worms to open on one question, I totally understand.
No, that's okay. I mean, I would, I don't have anything unique to someone who has dread specific to their worldview, right? I don't have anything specific to that. So I'm going to respond just again, in general, that when there's just a deep sense of anxiety, like I said, on one hand, like I said, what you want to do is identify ways that you can get out of that rut. So are there people that you can call up and just say, hey, let's get together. and not even talk about that, because you're not going to figure it out by spending every waking moment fanning that dread. And I realize you can't turn it off. I understand. And again, part of what I'm stumbling with is like, if it's so bad that it's debilitating, then we're talking like an obsessive compulsive disorder. And there is a whole line of treatment, which is actually different than what I'm talking about. So obsessive compulsive disorder actually is about not inhibiting your fears. It is actually allowing yourself to go all the way to feeling the incredible dread instead of being comforted by it, so that you literally get over the peak of the physiological arousal. So I'm putting that kind of in its own class. If you're, like I said, if you're that debilitated, what I'm going to say is not going to be helpful. But I'm saying people that are even dealing with like moderate dread and so forth, you need to find some way to not spend every waking moment just thinking about that. So however, you are distracted, like I said, and most of us aren't good at being distracted just by ourselves, turning on the TV or eating, right? Or something, which is why, like I said, I would encourage you, like, what do you love to do with other people? Go do something with other people so that you are trying to get out of your head. Okay? Because your emotions are going to continue to just overwhelm you if all you're doing is on your own, trying to prevent yourself from feeling dread. So I'm being very, very practical, right? And then continue to meet with people that have answers, that have studied in that domain. Like I said, find people who have struggled in some area of life, but have managed to be able to meet each day with a sense of joy despite uncertainty, because all of us have uncertainty. There's no way to get beyond uncertainty and be 100% confident in almost anything. So it's, again, being around those people, reading stories that are inspirational. That's one thing as well. I am a cancer survivor. So shocking. I'm a very healthy person, no risks, got the disease, went through all 3 levels of treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. And then when I was done, I actually remember I had 2 panic attacks once I finished my treatment. Because when I was in treatment, I'm like, oh, I'm killing cancer. I'm killing the rest of my body, but at least I'm in the process of actively fighting this thing. But then when I was done, it's like my particular cancer, my particular case, it's not like I get scans every year. And I remember I'd never had panic attacks before. And I just had these 2 panic attacks within a week. And it felt like I was dying. I was like, oh my word, this is what a panic attack is. So, my point is, I had to figure out, and I did it through a process of talking to people and praying and thinking about, what has changed. Like Julie, the day before, like I still had so many uncertainties in my life. They just weren't as obvious because I didn't have to face a, potentially lethal disease. But all I'm saying is that again, I had to just kind of try to work at getting over that and using both logic, but also distraction and so forth at the same time. So I don't know if I went around the circle too much, Justin, or if I...
No, I think you nailed it. That's perfect. Yeah, we like, myself included, when I first jumped into questioning my worldview and stuff like that, it's so easy to just think it's oh, I'll just be objective and just look at the evidence and follow where it leads and stuff like that. And those are all things we're shooting for. But it's like, yeah, we are kind of fighting this emotional battle too, and we don't realize it. And I think a lot of the tips you're giving on how to kind of put myself in the best position emotionally to handle that, I think totally stands. It's like looking back on my crisis, I'm like, oh yeah, I think it would have been going a lot better if I had adopted a lot of those habits, you know? So no, I think you hit the nail on the head. Caleb, did you have a question or did you just flip your video on? So I haven't put you on the spot.
No, yeah, I was going to ask a question first. Thanks, Julie, for the presentation. That was really interesting. Definitely the emotions and the tips you were mentioning, I found helpful for myself, especially when I was going through a lot of the more intense periods of doubt where I would get really distracted, just thinking and agonizing and dreading about whatever it might be. But then I'll work for a few hours at my job, and then I'll come out and I was distracted for a while, and then I felt fine just because I got my mind off of it. So that's something I've had firsthand experience in. My question is a bit more general. I'm wondering if you had any books you would recommend on the subject of managing emotions like that, and how to not let that not let emotions rule your life.
I don't have any off the top of my head, but I can get some for you, Caleb. I definitely can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and there are some good even self-help books out there on basically they're cognitive behavioral therapy techniques where you're writing down an emotion. You're basically doing evidence, you're weighing the evidence. So are you familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy?
No, not really.
Okay. So it is you identify your feelings, and then you write down like what's all the evidence for and against what you're feeling. So like a classic one, and I have a student right now that's struggling with this. Okay. She did really poorly on the first assignment. So often students that struggle will jump to conclusions, right? I did poorly on an assignment. I'm stupid. So your task would be, okay, so I feel, whatever the feeling is, I feel afraid or I feel anxious, and that I am stupid. So what's the evidence that you're stupid? And you literally do it kind of like you're being a detective, right? Okay, so what's your GPA, right? How many times have you gotten Fs on exams? Are you in college? Wow, the fact that you're in college means that you're in the top, certain percent of the entire US. So, okay, there was that one time in third grade when you got an F on the assignment, and you didn't turn it in. Okay, you're not as strong in math, so you get Cs. Okay, and you just do that. You just write down what's the evidence for and against. And then there are all of these illogical thinking identifiers, like jumping to conclusions. I mean, some of them we know just colloquially. Overgeneralization, right? Going from one context, saying I'm all of this in all my life. Black and white thinking. So it's similar to even some of the logical fallacies that you can find out there in logic and reasoning. But it's that same sort of thing, that you begin to stop and look at your feelings, identify the illogic that undergirds them. And again, it's not magic, but over time, you should start to reshape those emotions. So anyway, Caleb, I will find some books for you, both on cognitive behavioral specifically, but emotions in general.
Yeah, thanks. That what you just explained, the cognitive behavioral therapy, I think is fascinating. I mean, I do that mentally sometimes to try and think about what evidence there might be for feeling a particular emotion, but I've never thought to actually write it out. And I think that might definitely help for some stuff like that.
Sure.
Also, Caleb, when she sends you those books, please share them in the Struggle Bus chat for sure.
Sure thing. I'll do that.
Well, cool, everybody. Any other questions we have for Julie?
Can you speak to anxiety over lack of certainty in beliefs? Because a lot of people that we talk to are anxious over the fact that we can't be certain about Christianity being true. We can be very confident that it's true on the basis of the evidence, but that doesn't justify certainty in the rigorous deductive sense. Anything to say to that?
Yes, again, Jonathan, nothing really unique that I haven't said, right? Again, for some people, if that is just really severe, as I said, it might be helpful to go to a therapist that could help you in a similar way as if you had OCD, because obsessive compulsive disorder is about extreme anxiety and then engaging in certain behaviors to overcome that. So while it's not the same thing, it's definitely related. But so I don't have any specific advice about that, again, because that's a cognition, right? I mean, that is the reality of the world we live in. We don't have certainty on lots of things. There have certainly been there is a camp of psychotherapy thought that came out of humanism and existentialism, which is looking at existential dread, uncertainty of death and so forth. So there's a domain of writing there. Some of those were psychiatrists that went through the concentration camps too. So like the writing is interesting, but I don't find anything particularly helpful or revelatory in what they write, other than just kind of, we all have to sit with that truth that there is so much that is uncertain, right? And kind of facing that, and what does that mean? There are no specific techniques other than what I've said already to deal with them. I guess one thing that I've said many times, though, to people, which again, this is not revelatory, but you think about it, that really, what is anything that we know with 100% certainty, right? Like every time we get into our car, I don't know what the probability is of getting in a car accident, but it's very, very high over a 10-year period, right? But we do behaviors every day that if we would just really think of the probability, and we would have to have 100% certainty before we would do it, we wouldn't even get out of bed. And so kind of at least leveling the plane by saying, there is a lot that we do that we just take for granted. We don't think twice that it's going to be okay, that it's going to be problematic. And while this is bigger stakes, we shouldn't be debilitated just because we can't be 100% certain. Again, we are able to function on so many levels without certainty in so many domains of life.
Relating to that also is the need for cognitive closure that a lot of people have, where in order to be satisfied in one's worldview, one has to have all of one's questions fully answered to their satisfaction. And I think what you said there is germane to that also, that we make decisions all the time, and we acquire beliefs all the time without necessarily having all of our questions that might be asked answered. The question is, are there more numerous and more substantive objections to one view versus the other? And not knowing the answers to all of the particulars shouldn't necessarily be a reason not to be persuaded by the evidence taken as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I want to chime into for anyone watching that really struggles with that idea of kind of moving past this need for 100% certainty. Probably about a year and a half ago, it was a call with just me, Julie, Jonathan, where both of them kind of just said what they both said. And at the time I was like, there's no way I could ever move past that. And this is someone with like a diagnosed OCD. And it does get easier For sure. There's definitely still times I have to kind of rationalize myself through it and things like that. But it's not a daily basis. There's not as much dread with it. And you do kind of just come to understand, like, okay, yeah, this is how we live. And everyone lives like this, but not everyone recognizes that we're always going off of probabilities and none of them are 100% certain. So that's an encouragement I want to share as well for anyone that's feeling like they're really struggling with that.
And I would give one more piece of advice. Again, it seems pretty simple, but also narrowing the timeline that you're considering. This is just good in general with anxiety, right? Or any crisis, right? When you don't know exactly what to do, and the thought of, oh, what's tomorrow going to bring? What's the end going to bring? Then work on just narrowing the unit of time that you are considering. So what do I need to do to get through today? What am I going to focus on today? Today is all that I have. I'm not going to, try to think beyond today. And again, I know that inhibiting anxious thoughts is not something easily done, but at least trying to practice that, right? Which is, again, is another distraction tool, right? But to say, if I am only thinking about all of the future, or what is the truth about the entire universe every day, you are just going to be immobilized and exhausted by the weight of that every day. And so instead of taking all of that at once, both, taking one question at a time or looking at one piece of evidence at a time, or saying, what's one thing I'm going to do today that was different than what I did yesterday to try to, live more joyful, or try to manage these fears that I have. That's what's important as well.
Very cool.
And I will give you one more piece of advice, you all.
Do it.
Kind of tongue in cheek, although there's truth to it. So I always tell my students, if you want to really bring joy to your life and have someone that brings perspective into your life, hang out with 3 to 5-year-olds for a couple hours. They'll keep you grounded in what really matters. They'll distract you. They'll make sure that you're honest. And you will not be the same person, maybe for better or for, I would argue you'll be a better person, but seriously, right? Having little children around is a way to really pull you out of your world, get you into their world, make the moment what's really important. And I say it tongue in cheek, but I don't necessarily mean that it's not good advice.
That's awesome. Any final questions for Julie? And Julie, if maybe someone doesn't have a question right now, but they think of one later, is it okay if they reach out to you?
Most definitely. I welcome that.
Perfect. Are you okay if maybe I share your email address?
Sure. Certainly.
Perfect. Well, cool, everybody.
I have.
Oh yeah, hop in, Anna. Do it.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions. I think sometimes when we're in like a really emotional state, it's hard to even think clearly and to understand our own emotions, or understand exactly what I'm thinking and feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips for like how to think more clearly in those kind of situations? And then the other question are there kind of physical inputs or things that tend to affect these mental states? Like someone recently was telling me that parasites can cause OCD. But anyway, is there like foods that we can eat that maybe help or make worse these different mental states, or just different things that are more not like a mental thought process, but just like physical things? I guess you talked about exercise, but
Right.
things like that could help.
Right. So to your first question, as I said, it's, if your emotions are so strong, it's going to be very unlikely that you alone will be able to just think more clearly, right? So my advice is, like I said, do you have a couple people in your life who you can call, and they are savvy enough? So what I mean by that is you don't want someone who is just going to let you emote on them all the time. That doesn't mean never, but by constantly expressing your emotions, again, you're physiologically, you're not going to calm down. It actually, there's a point that just spewing emotion, which was what Freud thought you should always, like, you know, if we don't get, especially like our anger out or our anxiety out, that we're going to explode. That is not bore out in the studies at all. So it's not that you have to emote all the time, but that you would have some people, you know, you could call and say, I'm really struggling, like emotionally, and they would know, like, to let you talk maybe for 5 minutes, and then be able to meet with you or something and say, hey, let's go do something, right? Let's get our mind off of this. Let's go for a walk together. I'm going to play some music, that they would take over, if you will, finding other ways to make the environment such that you're not just on your own in your head. And it's not something that they can inevitably do. But so that's one thing I would say. And the biggest thing would be to, you know, how can you get yourself out of just basically navel gazing right on your emotions? How can you do that? So if that's, I would think, you know, getting some other friends would be the best way. Maybe if you have some music, maybe watching something, but again, my facial expression is showing that that's very unlikely that you can just distract yourself without the help of someone else. Like I said, volunteering, like if you can get involved in other people's lives, and you know that you have responsibilities elsewhere, that can be helpful. As far as other physical things, now, if you're talking about OCD specifically, Anna, I'm not familiar with a parasite or some other disease process. And in general, the research, like with autism and or ADHD and sugar or processed food and so forth, that research has not shown any support for those sorts of things. Now, that doesn't mean that in general, it's good to eat healthy, right? Like, it's probably good as much as you can to avoid processed food and lots of sugar and, you know, high fat and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying in general, but if you're thinking like there is some direct connection between food and OCD, or even really any psychological disorder, I'm not familiar at all with that. Now, there are some physical diseases that actually have depression as part of their symptomatology, or anxiety that's part of the symptomatology. Some that we know are directly related to the disease, and some that we're not sure if it's just kind of a secondary aspect to it. So like a lot of people who are suffering from Parkinson's end up with depression. And it's not clear, is that simply because they have Parkinson's, meaning they're psychologically aware of that, or is part of it the deterioration that's happening in the brain, even though it's not really in an area that you would think would be related to mood. But the brain is not as encapsulated as what we think. Like I said, the amygdala, you know, is involved in extreme emotion, but lots of things in terms of our psychological experience involves the brain as a whole. So studies that say, oh, this part is what's important in X functioning. Yes, that's true, but it's relative to the functioning of other parts. So it's not, it's not like, oh, because Parkinson's is dealing with motor functioning, that it would have nothing to do with depression. So, again, generally taking good care of yourself, exercising, spending time with friends, getting enough sleep, that's a huge one. Eating healthy is going to help, but there's no research evidence at this point that says, eat this and you will be able to combat that. Or, if you have high blood pressure, then you're going to end up having high anxiety. Yeah. Unfortunately, it would be nice if it were a little more clear like that, wouldn't it?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Any more questions for Julie? All right. I think we're all set. Like we said earlier, I will put Julie's contact on the Discord. But again, Julie, I just want to thank you so much for coming and talking with us. I think I know I've benefited from it both in the past and now. And I think people both here and then also viewing this on YouTube will definitely benefit. So again, thank you so much for just being a resource, for talking about doubts and everything and helping people walk through this really hard process.
Thank you, Justin. Can you stay on just a moment for me to ask you a few questions?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, thank you. And you all have a good evening or morning, wherever you are from.
Thank you, Julie. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Yeah.